GTA Vice City running on a PS2 from the year 2000 shouldn't be possible. The console only had 32 megabytes of main RAM and 4 megabytes of video memory. That's it. 4 megabytes to hold every texture of an entire living, breathing city. The neon signs, the beach sand, the hotel lobbies, the wet roads at night, the cars, the clothes, the skin on every face. For reference, a single high-resolution desktop wallpaper today is often larger than the PS2's entire graphics memory. And yet, when Vice City launched in October 2002, it didn't just run. It ran with 2 full islands, dozens of vehicles on screen simultaneously, dynamic weather, a full day-night cycle, 10 radio, stations playing licensed music, and hundreds of NPCs going about their lives. All on a console that on paper had absolutely no business doing any of that. So how did Rockstar pull this off? To understand that, you first need to understand what the PS2 actually was. Because this wasn't just an underpowered box that got lucky. It was one of the strangest and most misunderstood pieces of consumer hardware ever built. And most developers never even came close to figuring out what it could really do. Sony launched the PlayStation 2 in March 2000, and the centerpiece was something they called the Emotion Engine, a custom processor designed from scratch by Sony and Toshiba, built specifically to handle the kind of complex 3D worlds that were becoming the future of gaming. On paper, it was extraordinary. It ran at nearly 300 MHz, had a 128-bit architecture, and came with 2 built-in vector processing units, the VPU-0 and VPU-1, designed to handle geometry and mathematical transformations at speeds that looked impossible for that era. But here's where things got complicated. The Emotion Engine wasn't a normal processor. Most CPUs at the time were general purpose. They could handle anything you threw at them, whether it was physics, AI, rendering, or audio, switching between tasks constantly. The Emotion Engine was different. Its vector units were built for one thing: processing geometry at insane speeds. VPU-1, in particular, ran completely independently from the main CPU core, dedicated entirely to transforming 3D models, taking raw geometry data, applying lighting, perspective, and positional calculations, and sending it directly to the graphics chip. It worked in parallel with everything else, like a second brain that never stopped thinking about shapes and space. You can think of it like having a specialized co-pilot. The main CPU was the pilot, making decisions, running the game logic, managing AI, handling missions. The VPU-1 was the co-pilot, focused exclusively on transforming every polygon on screen from a 3D world position into a 2D pixel on your television. And they worked simultaneously, neither one waiting on the other, passing data back and forth through a dedicated pipeline at speeds that left other consoles from that era far behind. On paper, the PS2 could process 75 million polygons per second. In real complex scenes, that number dropped to somewhere between 15 and 20 million, still extraordinary for the time. But this power came with a catch. Programming the Emotion Engine correctly was genuinely hard. Getting the VPU-1 to run at full efficiency meant writing microcode, low-level instructions that developers had to craft manually, specifically designed for that hardware. Most studios didn't bother. It was too time-consuming, too specialized, and too far from the programming methods developers were used to, which is exactly why games on the PS2 from inexperienced teams often looked mediocre despite the hardware's potential. Rockstar, however, used a different approach, and it started with a decision that changed everything. Instead of building their own engine from scratch, which would have taken years, Rockstar licensed a piece of middleware called Renderware, developed by a British company called Criterion Software. And Renderware was special because Criterion had done something nobody else had at the time. They had already spent years learning exactly how to exploit the PS2's architecture, how to feed geometry to the VPU-1 efficiently, how to structure data so that the pipeline never stalled, how to use the hardware the way Sony actually intended it to be used. Renderware handled the low-level communication between the game and the hardware, which freed Rockstar to focus on what they were actually building: the world, the missions, the characters, systems. And the result was that the open-world streaming and city simulation that Vice City needed could actually run, because the foundation it was built on understood the machine. Between 2000 and 2004, Criterion claimed over 50% of the third-party engine market on PS2, and GTA Vice City was one of the crown jewels that proved why. It wasn't just that the game worked, it was that it worked at a scale that nothing else on that hardware had attempted. Now let's talk about memory, because 32 megabytes of main RAM and 4 megabytes of video memory is almost nothing, especially for a game the size and ambition of Vice City. And the way the PS2 handled memory made this even harder. The main RAM and video RAM were completely separate pools, and the GPU, called the graphics synthesizer, only had direct access to its own 4 megabytes. Everything had to be planned in advance. Every texture, every model, every piece of data had to be deliberately placed and managed. Think of it this way. You're cooking a full meal in a kitchen, but you only have a tiny counter, maybe the size of a laptop screen. You can't put everything out at once. You have to take things in and out of cabinets constantly. Use the counter for whatever you're actively working on, and put things away the moment you're done with them. That's essentially what the PS2 was doing with its memory every single frame of Vice City. The game was in a constant state of organized chaos, loading what was needed and discarding what wasn't. To make this work, Rockstar built an aggressive streaming system directly into the engine. The city was divided into chunks, sections of the map that the game would load from the disc as you moved through the world, and quietly unload when you moved away from them. You never experienced a traditional loading screen between streets or neighborhoods. The disc was spinning constantly in the background, feeding in the next section of the city before you ever arrived. It was like reading a book out loud where the next page was already being turned before you finished speaking. The PS2's DVD drive played a huge role here. DVD storage was substantial for its era, around 4.7 gigabytes on a single layer, more than enough to hold Vice City's full world at the quality Rockstar needed. But DVD read speeds were relatively slow, which meant the streaming system had to be incredibly smart about what it loaded and when, predicting where the player was likely to go and prefetching that data slightly ahead of time. If the prediction was wrong, you'd see it. Objects and buildings suddenly appearing in the distance as the data caught up. Those were the pop-ins that anyone who played the original PS2 version remembers. They weren't a failure of the streaming system. They were evidence of how close to the limit it was operating at every second. But memory was only the beginning, because what the graphics synthesizer was doing visually, within 4 megabytes of VRAM, was genuinely shocking. The PS2's GPU was not a normal chip. The graphics synthesizer had one of the most unusual architectures in console history. Instead of having a large pool of external video memory connected by a relatively slow bus, the way most graphics chips worked, the GS had its 4 megabytes of VRAM embedded directly inside the chip itself, connected by an internal bus running at 48 gigabytes per second. For context, the PS2's main memory bus ran at 3.2 gigabytes per second. The graphics chip's internal bandwidth was 15 times faster. So even though there was barely any video memory, what was there could be accessed and processed at extraordinary speed. Rockstar and Criterion exploited this by keeping textures small and reusing them aggressively. That neon pink wall you see repeating across half the buildings in Vice City, it's the same texture, tiled and slightly color shifted. The road surface on every street in the city, the same handful of textures, rotated and stretched across the entire map. The palm trees on the beach, the same model, scaled slightly differently and scattered across the landscape. None of it is the unique, individually crafted surface it appears to be. It's the same materials, reused hundreds of times across the world, with just enough variation in placement and lighting to make the city feel diverse. And this is actually where Vice City's art direction became one of its greatest technical advantages. Because Rockstar didn't just choose Miami and the 1980s as a setting for creative reasons. That era and that city are defined by bold, simple colors: hot pink, turquoise, yellow, white, flat neon surfaces, clean geometric buildings, bright skies. That aesthetic required far fewer complex, high-detail textures than a realistic modern city would. The art direction was specifically suited to what the hardware could handle. Every creative decision was, at least in part, a technical one. Now let's talk about vehicles, because this is where one of the most creative memory tricks in gaming history came into play. And it came directly from the PS2's memory limits. Obavamaj, Vice City's technical director, has spoken about this in detail. At any given moment, the PS2 could only hold around 7 different vehicle models in memory at once. 7. The game had a pool of over 80 vehicle types. Cars, motorbikes, boats, helicopters, planes, but you could never see more than 7 different models at the same time. The moment an 8th model was needed, the oldest or least important one was pushed out of memory to make room. This should have been catastrophically obvious. You'd drive 3 streets and see the same car repeating over and over. But Rockstar designed around this constraint in a way that made it invisible. The game was constantly predicting what vehicles it was about to need, based on where you were and what the mission required. If you were near the police station, cop cars stayed in memory. If a mission was about to spawn a specific vehicle, the engine quietly loaded it in the background before you ever needed it. And when you hit 6 stars and the FBI needed to show up in their black sedans, the game knew that was coming, shuffled the pool, and had them ready before your wanted level even finished loading. On top of that, the vehicle models themselves were built to look distinct from each other, despite sharing many of the same underlying geometry tricks. Different color palettes, different silhouettes, different wheel types, all designed to make 7 models feel like a city full of variety. Players drove through Vice City for hours without ever consciously noticing the limit. You guys know Rockstar. They always find a way. Now let's talk about one of the most technically impressive parts of the entire game, the audio. Because Vice City didn't just have background music. It had 10 fully licensed radio stations, each with its own playlist, its own DJ, its own commercials, its own personality. Over 100 songs from the 1980s, all streaming in real time while you drove around an open world, while the game simultaneously processed physics, AI, rendering, and mission scripts on 32 megabytes of RAM. The way Rockstar solved this was through dedicated audio streaming, completely separate from the world data pipeline. Rather than loading radio audio into the main memory pool, which would have consumed a devastating portion of the available budget, the audio was streamed directly from the disc into a separate channel, almost like a second, parallel read process happening alongside the world loading. The PS2's audio processor, the SPU2, had its own memory and its own pipeline, meaning sound could be handled independently without eating into the main RAM that the game world needed. The radio stations were stored on the disc in a compressed format that the system could decompress in real time, trading some processing overhead for a massive reduction in data size. It's the same basic principle as streaming a song on your phone instead of downloading it. You're trading storage space for a live feed that exists only while you need it. The PS2 was doing this with 10 different stations, on hardware released in the year 2000, and it worked so seamlessly that most players never once thought about how any of it was possible. And then there's the living world itself, because beyond the vehicles and the buildings and the audio, Vice City had to feel alive. There were pedestrians walking the streets, swimming at the beach, sitting on benches, reacting to traffic, running from gunshots. There was a day-night cycle. There was rain and thunder. There were gangs with territories. There was a police system that remembered your crimes and escalated responses. All of this had to run simultaneously, within what was left of the PS2's memory after the world, vehicles, textures, and audio had taken their share. To manage this, Rockstar used a simulation bubble, a concept where only things within a certain radius of the player were actively simulated at full detail. NPCs outside that bubble weren't running full AI. They were frozen, waiting to be activated the moment they entered your awareness. Vehicles spawned in just ahead of your travel direction and were removed behind you. Gang territories only checked for conflict when the player was close enough to matter. The entire living world was a carefully maintained illusion, where the things you could actually see and interact with were real, and everything else was quietly suspended in the background. The weather system worked similarly. Rain wasn't being simulated across the entire city. It was calculated locally, around the player, creating the effect of a citywide storm without the cost of actually running one. Fog served a dual purpose. It looked like atmosphere and felt like Vice City's humid coastal character, while simultaneously limiting how far the engine had to render. Every tool that made the city feel real was also a tool that kept the hardware alive. When GTA Vice City launched on October 29, 2002, it didn't just become the best-selling game of the year. It became proof of something that the industry was still debating at the time, that an open world could be truly alive, could truly feel like a place, on hardware that had no technical right to support it. A 50-person team at Rockstar North built this in roughly 9 months. 9 months to create 2 full islands, hundreds of thousands of lines of dialogue, a complete 1980s Miami recreation, 10 radio stations, and one of the most intricate real-time simulation systems ever put on a disc. They did it with 32 megabytes of RAM. They did it with 4 megabytes of video memory. They did it by understanding their hardware deeply enough to use every trick it had, by designing their art to match what the machine could carry, and by hiding every constraint so completely that millions of players spent hundreds of hours in that world without ever suspecting a single one. Vice City sold over 17.5 million copies. It became the 4th best-selling PS2 game in the United States, and to this day, fans consider it one of the greatest open-world maps Rockstar ever made. Not despite its constraints, but in many ways because of them. The limits forced precision. The limits forced creativity. The limits produced something that still holds up more than 20 years later. And if you want to see how Rockstar pulled off an even bigger miracle on even older hardware, how they built Red Dead Redemption 2 on a PS4 from 2013, then check out that video right there. And if technical breakdowns like this are what you're here for, subscribe, because there's a lot more coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.